By spring of 215, Carthaginian forces under Mago Barca intended to reinforce the war in Italy, and Hasdrubal the Bald, intended to bolster the revolt against Rome in Sardinia, were nearly ready. But before either army could make way, the Senate learned of the defeat at Hibera. Tensions rose on how to respond to the Scipio brothers. This exposed the divide between the Barcid faction in favor of the war in Italy and the so-called anti-war faction led by Hanno II, which opposed Hannibal's war of conquest. Nevertheless, the Sardinian expedition was to sail as planned once all troops and provisions were gathered. But Mago was ordered not to depart for Italy until an agreement for the situation in Iberia was reached. The cunning Hanno II and his allies succeeded in delaying yet again, leaving Hannibal on his own in Italy for at least another year.
Right then, it's 2025 and I'm ready. You are ready. No more excuses for looking like an ungroomed caveman. It's time to get some action. This year you can go in ready with the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped. It is the secret weapon for a successful evening of mingling. First up, you got the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. This thing is incredible, precise, smooth, and won't leave you looking like you've trimmed yourself with a chainsaw. Whether it's for a date night or an office party, it gets the job done. No nicks, no fuss, just results. Next, nose hairs. They used to crop up once a year when I was younger, but now it's twice a month that I have to trim that thing. No one wants to be that guy at the table with a bush sticking out of their every orifice. Whip up the Weed Whacker 2.0 for staying nice and polished. To top things off, treat your downstairs marbles with the Crop Soother Ball Aftershave and the Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant to stay fresh and comfortable. To round things up, Boxers 2.0, by far the comfiest boxers I've ever worn, and the Slick Shed 2.0 toiletry bag to keep everything organized come with the package, so don't be the scruffy one this year. Come in looking sharp and polished when the party lights come on. Use my promo code and you'll get 20% off plus free international shipping at checkout. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the promo code HistoryMarsh at the checkout. Your courage bags will thank you.
As pleasing as it was for the Roman Senate to learn about the victory at Hibera, their attention was fully directed towards the upcoming campaign on the home front in Italy. The situation in Bruttium continued to worsen. After an 8-month siege, Petelia fell to the Carthaginians. The city suffered brutal punishment for their resistance. Hanno the Elder then swiftly advanced onto Consentia without resting his troops, fully realizing the importance of breaking the Petelia-Consentia axis as the two most important pro-Roman cities in Bruttium. The news of the horrors that took place in Petelia preceded the Carthaginian army. In Consentia, the pro-Roman faction wanted to prepare for a siege. But still without a significant victory in Italy, there was little support for the Roman cause among the populace. Fearing they would suffer the same fate as Petelia, the people of Consentia decided to surrender. With the gates to Bruttium now open, a new wave of support came for the Carthaginians. Towns from the hills mobilized their own militia army to exact revenge on Croton, another pro-Roman city the natives deemed treacherous for siding with the enemy. The army of Hanno the Elder soon reached Locri, which surrendered without a fight. Other cities quickly followed suit. With the large port of Locri now in Carthaginian hands, Hanno the Elder sent a message to Carthage that a suitable safe haven for Carthaginian ships had been secured, urging the Senate to send Mago with the requested troops, supplies, and funds as soon as possible. But Hanno II and his wealthy allies had other plans. For 3 months now, Mago Barca had been trying to get approval from the Senate to set sail with his army. He and the pro-Barcid faction argued that if Hannibal defeated Rome in Italy, the war would be won. But Fearing the growing influence of the Barcid family, Hanno II rallied behind the wealthy aristocracy, who above all else did not want to see Hannibal become the most powerful man in Carthage once the war was over. In their minds, as the man who conquered Rome, there would be no one to stop Hannibal from becoming a de facto emperor. Conveniently, their stance was that reinforcements should not go to the Barcid brother that was winning, but to the Barcid brother that was losing. Mago Barca would not be sailing for the port of Locri in Italy. He was to take his army of 12,000 experienced African infantry and 6,000 Numidian cavalry to Iberia, stripping Hannibal of these much-needed reinforcements. This was the ripple effect of the defeat at Hibera. The victory of the Scipio brothers over Hasdrubal unintentionally gave political ammunition to Hanno II and his anti-Barcid faction, and they used it to great effect. For a third year in a row now, they've successfully prevented any significant reinforcements from being sent to Hannibal. Instead of the army, supplies, and funds he was promised, Hannibal would be getting only 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 40 elephants from the Senate. Ironically, the other army of 12,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry, recruited under Hasdrubal the Bald, would make way as planned to reinforce the revolt against Rome in Sardinia. But the Romans had troubles of their own. The situation in Sicily remained bleak. Appius Claudius began operations to recover parts of the island. Undermanned and undersupplied, he avoided attacking the more consolidated Syracusans and instead began the grueling task of quelling the rebellion of the Greek cities in the north of the island, an uncertain campaign that would drag on for a year. Despite the situation in Sicily, the primary objective for the year 215 was to contain Hannibal. All Roman resources went towards supplying the three massive armies in Campania. Yet, the Roman generals would not challenge the Carthaginian in open battle. Caution was the order of the day. Moreover, a great cause for concern were rumors that Capua was pressuring Cumae to switch sides. To reassert Roman authority, Gracchus crossed the Volturnus River. Once celebrated as one of the most powerful cities in Italy, Cumae held a hillside position on the edge of the most fertile part of the Campanian plain, and its port still secured influence overseas. And as it turned out, the rumors were true. The Capuans wanted to use a nearby festival to invite Cumae's officials for talks. If the negotiations didn't go as planned, their intention was to storm the city while most of the garrison was away enjoying the festivities. Although unaware of what the Capuans were planning, Gracchus was suspicious enough to scout the surrounding area and make camp close to Cumae. He ordered the inhabitants to stay behind the walls and stockpile provisions. Concerned about Hannibal's trickery, the Roman consul did not want to risk losing the important city to the enemy. The hidden Capuan camp was soon discovered. Gracchus launched a surprise attack at midnight the same day. With a substantial portion of the Capuan contingent attending the festival in the hope that the Cumaeans would show up, the weakly defended camp was overrun. Over 2,000 Capuans were killed, including their commander. For Gracchus, this concentration of Capuan forces meant only one thing. It wouldn't be long before the Carthaginian army appeared. Indeed, Hannibal, having known about the conspiracy beforehand, was already on his way. Fabius's scouts discovered Hannibal's movement. He could have put pressure on the Carthaginian army on its northern flank, albeit by committing to a dangerous crossing of the Volturnus while the enemy was nearby. Instead, Fabius refused to leave his fortified position north of the river. Gracchus was on his own. Sensing danger, he did not wait for his own scout reports, but swiftly withdrew behind the walls of Cumae. His instincts were right. Soon after, a tower lookout spotted Hannibal's standard on the horizon. With his army of 40,000, Hannibal arrived before the gates of Cumae sometime in June 215. He deployed at some distance and challenged the Romans to fight him. The 25,000-strong Roman army was outnumbered, but the sloped terrain in front of the city favored the defenders. The Carthaginians would have to slog their way up to attack a Roman army deployed in front of the walls. But the troops under Gracchus's command were a mix of allies and volunteer slaves. The Roman consul constantly drilled his men to form a proper fighting force, but he still deemed them unfit to fight against Hannibal's veteran mercenaries in open battle. The Romans would stay behind the walls of Cumae. Meanwhile, the construction that had been going on in the Carthaginian battle line turned out not to be the setting of camps, but the constructing of towers. This time, Hannibal would force the issue. The Romans scrambled to construct their own tower. Once ready, a Carthaginian formation arrayed behind the tower and advanced towards the wall. Gracchus directed his men to place the Roman tower to counter the focus point of Hannibal's attack. A rain of projectiles was exchanged, and parts of the two towers kept catching fire, which the soldiers frantically extinguished. Finally, the Carthaginian tower reached the wall. Despite being outnumbered at the top, Hannibal's experienced troops remained steadfast, pushing their way onto the wall. The fighting was brutal, but the Roman discipline held until both sides were exhausted. As the Carthaginians withdrew the tower, the less experienced Roman soldiers wanted to take the fight to the enemy. This is what Hannibal was hoping for, that a minor Roman victory will motivate them to accept a battle in the open. But Gracchus knew better. However, seeing Hannibal arraying new formations at various points along the wall, and more construction possibly going on behind enemy lines, he assumed that a renewed attack was coming. Having barely held the Carthaginians at bay during the first assault, the Roman consul feared that his troops might not be able to prevent Hannibal from storming the city, and he ordered the men to withdraw behind the walls of the citadel. But Hannibal was just as unwilling to risk his irreplaceable troops in a chaotic battle among the streets and houses of Cumae. He too withdrew and marched back to his camp at Mount Tifata. But while the attack on Cumae went on, Fabius finally broke camp and crossed the river. However, he did not attempt to flank Hannibal and surround his position from the rear. Instead, he made his way towards Suessula, where he joined forces with Marcellus. All three Roman armies were now south of the Volturnus. Hannibal was hemmed in. Ironically, his success in persuading the Italic state to join his cause was now contributing to the success of the Fabian strategy. The Carthaginian general could no longer march his smaller army away to another region and lure the Romans into a battle. Now he had allies to protect, chiefly Capua. Despite being outnumbered, he had to fight to preserve the coalition he had created. Rome, meanwhile, continued avoiding a major battle, instead directing their attacks on Hannibal's allies. In July, Marcellus left camp to raid the towns in Samnium. Hannibal now faced a dilemma. With only 40,000 troops, he faced up to 100,000 Romans. He could split his forces to check Marcellus and protect Capua at the same time, but this would leave him at grave risk of being overrun. Or he could concentrate his forces near Capua and leave the Samnite towns to their fate. which would make him appear weak and unable to protect his allies, something that would quickly lead to the breakup of his Italian coalition. Soon enough, the Samnites sent envoys seeking help from Hannibal. After some deliberation, the Carthaginian broke camp, but he surprised everyone by making way for Nola for a second time. The wily general correctly guessed that neither Fabius nor Gracchus would challenge him in the open, and he thus outmaneuvered the Romans yet again. Hannibal's thinking was sound. Nola held an important position, being on the main road that cut through Campania. Devastating the region around the city would both satisfy his army and force Marcellus away from Samnium. Moreover, the pro-Carthaginian settlement was still strong in the city, and if it went over to the Carthaginian side, Hannibal's lines of communication in Campania would strengthen and push the Romans towards the sea. In addition, Hannibal sent word to Hanno the Elder, recalling him back to Campania, just as he was preparing to attack Rhegium. Realizing the danger, Marcellus immediately turned back. The Second Battle of Nola was about to begin. It's mid-August 215 BC. For over a month now, Carthaginian troops plundered the countryside around the city of Nola. Joined by Hanno's army from Bruttium, Hannibal made a point of ravaging the land right in front of the gates, where the inhabitants could see their fields and property burning. Undermining Roman authority in this way, he hoped, would drive Marcellus to meet him in open battle, or suffer the embarrassment for refusing to fight. Amazingly, the political elite of Nola still preferred to man the walls instead of confronting the enemy. But Marcellus ordered the legions to deploy. Aware that support for Hannibal among residents of Nola was strong, he understood that the continuation of political wrangling could turn this situation into a proper debacle, with the whole city rebelling against Rome. Worse, if Hannibal was allowed time to build siege towers, as he had done at Cumae in 215, the Roman army could end up being trapped between the Carthaginian assault on the walls and fighting the rebels in the streets. Action needed to be taken now. Once the last of his men exited, Marcellus ordered the gates shut and rushed to meet Hannibal head-on. Much like in the first encounter, he forewent arraying the troops in battle formation for the sake of speed. And again, the shock of the Roman attack initially threw the Carthaginians off balance. During the next half hour, more troops from each side joined the battle. However, a sudden rainstorm then quickly turned the ground into mud. Hannibal's veterans gained the upper hand in these conditions, inflicting losses and forcing back the Roman line. But the continued fighting wore down both sides, forcing the men to withdraw as night was fast approaching. The torrential rain kept the two armies in their camps for another 2 days. But once the third day dawned, the weather cleared and the ground hardened. Marcellus surprised Hannibal by deploying his troops in front of the walls yet again. To both Hannibal and the citizens of Nola, the message was clear: Rome would not back down. This time, it was Hannibal's turn to accept the challenge. Marcellus impressed upon the men that they fought hard to stop Hannibal once, fight hard today, and they reap the spoils of victory once again. No quarter was given by either side. The experienced Carthaginians wanted to reaffirm their supremacy, while the Romans were eager to prove themselves against Hannibal. The vicious fighting lasted for much of the afternoon. Fatigue kicked in, thousands fell, some cut down, others crushed in the mass of soldiers. Having the walls behind him protected Marcellus's rear, preventing Hannibal from utilizing his mobile cavalry to strike the Roman flanks. As the battle of attrition wore on, the Romans persisted and wore down the Carthaginians. With the night again looming, Hannibal backed off. Marcellus had again stood toe-to-toe against the Carthaginian general. The next day, both commanders agreed to a temporary truce to allow each side to collect and bury their dead. Nola remained in Roman hands. By September 215 BC, with 20,000 troops under the command of Hanno the Elder and another 40,000 troops commanded by Hannibal, the Carthaginians faced up to 100,000 Roman troops in Campania. Still, Hannibal was unable to force Fabius into a decisive battle. Changing tact yet again, he garrisoned key cities and marched east to winter quarters in Apulia. Hanno the Elder, meanwhile, made his way back to Bruttium to continue the subjugation of the region. With the Carthaginian army now gone from Campania, the Romans finally enjoyed some respite. Fabius ordered grain collected from nearby cities and brought to the Roman army wintering at Suessula. To lessen the supply burden on the allies, he left Marcellus only with a garrison detachment and sent the rest of the army that fought at Nola back to Rome, where they could be supplied more efficiently and get some much-needed rest. Gracchus was sent trailing after Hannibal to observe his movements from a safe distance, with strict orders to avoid a pitched battle. Back in Rome, alarm was raised in the prison buried at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Built underground, this place was meant to be a fate worse than death. Yet, a most valuable prisoner had somehow escaped this dark, damp, and foreboding subterranean dungeon. Managing to disguise himself, he then made his way to Ostia on a donkey, stolen at the local market, where he boarded a small vessel and set out to meet with the king of Macedon. The mysterious man was the last surviving member of the delegation in charge of brokering the alliance between Hannibal and Philip, which was captured off the coast of Brundisium by the Romans earlier in the summer, before being transported first to Cumae and then sentenced to imprisonment by the Roman Senate. But traumatized by what he had endured during interrogation in the dungeons of Rome, the diplomat was unable to remember the exact terms of the treaty once he had reached Philip's court. Nevertheless, his most remarkable escape gave the king of Macedon an early warning, and a second delegation was promptly dispatched to meet Hannibal and draft the agreement anew. Across the sea in Iberia, the Scipio brothers wrote to the Senate detailing their successes, but stressed that they lacked the money needed to stay in the fight. They borrowed heavily from the Iberian allies to pay the wages of the troops and sailors, and insisted the Senate provide for everything else, chiefly clothing and grain, among other provisions. Without help, the Scipios claimed, the army and the province would collapse by the end of the year. Unable to finance the effort in Iberia due to the high cost of maintaining the war against Hannibal in Italy, the Senate had no choice other than to turn to creditors. Major concessions were offered. Those who took contracts to supply the army in Iberia were exempt from military service, probably along with their sons, and were to be paid first with interest, with payment guaranteed even in the event of a shipwreck or capture by the enemy. The state taking on the full risk of transportation was a risky proposition at best, but the Roman Senate really had no choice. The contract was taken by 57 private individuals, split into 3 companies, and the ships finally embarked for Spain. The Scipio brothers would get the supplies they needed. And, unbeknownst to the Romans, the risk they took with creditors came at the 11th hour, because around this time Mago Barca finally embarked for Iberia with funds, supplies, and reinforcements. Whoever reached their destination first could potentially tip the balance of the war in Spain. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal the Bald's expedition to Sardinia was derailed when his fleet was blown off course, ending up in the Balearic Islands. Many of the ships had to be hauled ashore for repairs before the voyage continued. The 12,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry were much welcomed reinforcements to Hampsicora's pro-Carthaginian Sardinian revolt after their defeat at Cornus a year earlier, which left them with some 3,000 men. The delay, however, allowed Titus Manlius Torquato to rebuild his army at Caralis. To his 5,000 legionaries who survived the prior clash with the Sardinians, he was able to add some 4,000 troops whose health had barely recovered from malnourishment and scurvy, though many of these men were still only fit for defense duties. Crucially, another 6,000 were on their way from Rome. While these were inexperienced troops, they were vital for shoring up Titus's ranks. Hasdrubal the Bald landed at Tharos in early autumn of 215 BC, where he was greeted by Hampsicora. The combined Carthago-Sardinian army wasted no time in marching south, aware that there was no better time to fight the Romans, many of whom were still suffering from sickness. Meanwhile, 60 Carthaginian warships and an unknown number of transports tracked the movement of the army, following the coast until they reached Caralis. Hasdrubal the Bald's intention was to fully encircle the city and starve the Romans into submission. There was no Roman fleet nearby to lift the blockade and open lines of communication, and Titus lacked the supplies to withstand a long siege. Trapped in the city, he and his army would face ruin. Left with no other choice, the Roman general marched his sickly men to meet the Carthaginians in the open. The two opponents did not immediately engage, encamping on an open plain west of the river Flumini Manu. Hasdrubal the Bald, while initially intending to press the Romans as soon as the opportunity presented itself, was surprised to see that Titus left the protection of the walls of Caralis, a bold move considering that a third of his army was not combat ready. The Carthaginian general wanted to reassess the situation. He sent his skirmishers to test the enemy's resolve. During the first day, the fast-moving Numidian horse pressed the Romans. But Titus's men snapped at the Carthaginians, winning several minor engagements. To Hasdrubal, this did not seem like a weary army. However, by the second day of skirmishing, the Roman general could no longer disguise the weakened state of his legions. He ordered the men to stay on the defensive and not venture forward. With so many men unfit for battle, he couldn't risk losing troops that actually were combat ready to exhaustion, injury, or death. Thus, the Romans backed off. This was the sign Hasdrubal was looking for. Titus's men were weak, after all. In the morning hours of the third day, Carthaginian troops were ordered to array for battle. Some 15,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry took to the field. The Roman numbers are quoted as high as 22,000 infantry, but due to sickness and heavy losses while fighting the Sardinians during the previous year, it is likely that their effective strength was closer to 16,000 infantry and 1,200 horse. The exact deployment on the day remains vague, but it is thought that Hasdrubal formed a strong centre, flanked by the Sardinians and cavalry on the wings, along with several elephants. Titus mirrored this, placing his veteran and most rested troops in the centre, flanked by the less experienced men that recently arrived from Rome and those barely fit for battle, with cavalry on the wings. Once the deployment was complete, Hasdrubal gave the order to attack. He took position in the center left, while two other commanders by the names of Mago and Hanno led the cavalry contingents on each wing. Hampsicora commanded the Sardinians on the right, while his son Hyostus took position with his countrymen on the left. The deliberate slow advance served to intimidate the Romans, and Titus made sure to steady the men before the first blows were exchanged. The fighting in the center had been the fiercest, but neither side could get an advantage early on. Hasdrubal predicted this and had ordered Mago and Hanno to drive the enemy cavalry from the field and encircle Titus's center. The Roman cavalry, although slightly outnumbered, held the Numidians at bay. But it was the weary Roman infantry flanking Titus's center that took the brunt of the fighting. Unable to hold, they were gradually ground down and pushed back. The decisive moment, however, came when the Roman detachment facing the Sardinians on the right managed to drive them back after Hyostus fell fighting in the front ranks. When his troops learned of his death, the entire Sardinian contingent on the Carthaginian left broke and fled. Much of the Roman foot could not be restrained and gave chase. They gave no quarter to the fleeing Sardinians and took no prisoners. Crucially, Titus did manage to rally the cavalry on the right and have them wheel inward to attack the Carthaginian center. Hasdrubal and his men stood their ground, but as the Romans enveloped their position, they were gradually cut down to a man. Roman casualties are unknown, but given the overall state of Titus's army and a high attrition during the grueling campaign in Sardinia, losses were likely in the thousands. For the Carthaginian host, the defeat was catastrophic. Hasdrubal the Bald, along with his lieutenants Mago and Hanno, were captured. Hyostus was killed in the fighting, and his father Hampsicora fled the field. 12,000 fell in battle, while another 1,500 were taken prisoner. Some 3,000 men did manage to escape and head for the coast, where they boarded the waiting ships and promptly sailed for Carthage. But they wouldn't get far before they accidentally ran into a Sicilian contingent of the Roman fleet returning from a raiding mission in Africa. Against 60 Carthaginian warships, the Roman fleet of 100 quinquerenes had a clear advantage. Commanded by Titus or Catulus Crassus, they managed to capture 7 Carthaginian ships, while the rest scattered and made for Africa. In the aftermath of the battle, Hampsicora retreated to Cornus along with the scattered remains of the Sardinian army. But upon learning of his son's fate, he ended his own life. The Sardinian revolt had been defeated. Rebel cities surrendered to Rome, which allowed for some of the troops to return to Italy. The grain supply could resume uninterrupted, an important factor given the damage done to Roman agriculture in Italy. Crucially, the victory at Caralis denied the Carthaginians bases on Sardinia, from where Italy would have been in striking distance. It would be another 5 years before Carthage would threaten Roman domination in Sardinia. Back in Campania, Fabius harassed the holdings of the Carthaginians and their allies, fouling the fields around Capua. But Hannibal made sure the garrisons were well provisioned and could withstand the pressure until his return from Apulia. In addition, fast-moving Capuan irregular cavalry countered the Romans, in turn disrupting their supply lines, killing off patrols, and setting ambushes for the marching armies. Fabius, unwilling to risk being bogged down in enemy territory, retreated to his winter quarters at Suessula. To the south, 4,000 Numidian horse and 40 elephants reached Locri, where they were received by Hanno the Elder. Compared to the number of troops Hannibal was promised, this was a token force, and these would be the only reinforcements that Carthage sent to Italy via the sea throughout the war. With his numbers raised to around 23,000, Hanno the Elder marched west to besiege the vital city of Rhegium, one of the last Roman holdouts in Bruttium. For over a month, Hanno besieged the city, but was unable to fully prevent it from being supplied by sea. 2 major attacks were mounted on the walls, both repulsed. Then a message arrived from the Bruttians asking for aid in taking the city of Croton. Hanno lifted the siege and hurried east. Campaigning season was coming to an end, and while Rhegium was a valuable target, Croton was also of great importance, its fortress dominating the surrounding region. The Bruttians had managed to breach the walls, but were unable to take the citadel. Shortly after Hanno's arrival, the citadel was taken. The Carthaginians could now direct all of their efforts in Bruttium at Rhegium, the last city in the region still loyal to Rome. Hannibal, meanwhile, was settling in for the winter at Arpi. By now it became clear that his greatest weakness was the poor performance of Carthage's generals in other theatres and the lack of support for the war in Italy from the Carthaginian Senate. And with the Romans refusing to risk fighting decisive battles, instead opting for a war of attrition, Hannibal was becoming increasingly desperate for more troops, without which he would not be able to match the Romans for much longer. But there was some good news for Hannibal in the winter of 215. Another delegation from Philip of Macedon disembarked and met up with Hannibal at Arpi. They informed the Carthaginian general that the previous embassy was intercepted and imprisoned, and that the terms of the first agreement were lost. The second agreement was drafted, and the delegates set off for Macedon once again, this time successfully avoiding Roman naval patrols. Philip's armies would be joining the war next year. Hannibal also received an embassy from Syracuse. The pro-Carthaginian faction, riled up by its leaders Hippocrates and Epicides, who came to the island last winter, had convinced the young king Hieronymus to fully commit to Hannibal's cause, on the promise of being given full control of Sicily after the war. Hieronymus's army could now push west to expel the Romans from the island, and the Syracusan fleet could contest the seas around the Strait of Messina. This forced Rome to divert invaluable resources to Sicily to ensure they maintained a foothold on the island. The turning of Sicily into a full-blown theatre of war relieved some pressure on Hannibal and bolstered his position in Italy, so much so that the Roman Senate had already begun plans to transfer none other than Marcellus to the island next year, which will strip Italy of the only Roman general who was thus far successful in stopping Hannibal in battle. Despite receiving little help from Carthage, Hannibal would use the events in Sicily and Macedon to attempt to maintain the initiative in 214 BC.
January 214 BC. Carthaginian general Hannibal, the victor of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, consolidated his position in southern Italy. His army defeated all that Rome had thrown at it. But years of campaigning and lack of support from Carthage had exhausted even his grizzled veterans. Many had been with him for the past 7 years, pacifying the tribes of Iberia, marching through Gaul, and crossing the Alps to bring war into Italy. Yet Rome proved itself an enemy who did not know when he was beaten. Fabius Maximus had blunted Hannibal's lightning campaign, and had rebuilt Rome's shattered armies. Recruiting another 6 legions in January, the consul now had 18 legions at his disposal, nearly 200,000 troops across all theatres of war. The resolve of the Romans was unquestionable. On paper, Hannibal could not match the might of his foe with only 60,000 men, but despite inferior numbers, he had outfoxed the Romans many times before. If there was one man who understood that in a game of chess, a well-placed pawn can be more powerful than a king, it was Hannibal. In his winter quarters near Arpi, Hannibal prepared to use Apulia as the staging ground for the campaign of 214 BC. But no sooner had the snow melted than a messenger arrived from Capua. The Capuans dreaded the fresh build-up of Roman forces around Campania, knowing that it was their defection that Rome resented the most. They requested Hannibal's aid. Owing to the urgency of the message, Hannibal scrapped whatever plans he may have had in Apulia and sent word to Hanno in Bruttium to march north and meet him in Campania. On his way back towards the Apennine Mountains, Hannibal brazenly marched his troops within a stone's throw of the Roman camp at Luceria. The two armies could almost make eye contact. One eager Roman centurion turned to his men, as if about to give the signal to charge. If there was ever a time to attack Hannibal, it was now, while his army was vulnerable in marching formation. But Gracchus was apprehensive. That Hannibal had the gall to pass so close to the Roman camp surely meant that he was baiting them into a trap, or so Gracchus thought. Little did he know that this was exactly what Hannibal wanted him to think. In his haste to come to Capua's aid, the cunning Carthaginian general took a calculated risk. He knew that exposing himself to attack would be seen as a provocation and would in turn pin Gracchus in place for fear of an ambush. Still, despite the Roman general's suspicions, there was no trap. But by the time he realized this, the chance to wrong-foot Hannibal had gone. This paralyzing paranoia that Hannibal instilled in the Roman leadership was unheard of, and perhaps not repeated by any other enemy of Rome throughout its history. And now he was on his way back to Capua. Trailed by Gracchus, Hannibal pillaged the lands of Benevento, seeking to provoke his enemy into a fight. Gracchus, however, was under strict orders not to advance beyond Benevento, thus allowing the Carthaginian army to slip away. At this time, the Roman leadership faced a most bizarre crisis: bad omens. Witnesses saw a woman turn into a man. A crow built a nest inside a temple. A tree lit itself on fire. Animals spoke in human tongue. Widespread sightings like these paralyzed the state. In the minds of the superstitious Romans, the gods were not happy, which could have dire consequences, especially in times of war. Senate proceedings were halted for several weeks so that elaborate rituals could be performed. Once diviners and soothsayers were consulted and the so-called peace of the gods was secured, did matters turn to dealing with the mortal men Rome feared the most. But upon reaching Campania, Hannibal quickly found that the situation was not as urgent as the Capuans had previously reported. Roman presence had increased, it was true, but the Carthaginian general had already prepared for this before leaving Campania at the end of 215 BC. He doubled the garrisons across the region. Fortifications were strengthened. Provisions were stockpiled to last a year. Thus, despite the reports, his presence in Campania was not required. Recalling him from Apulia was a major blunder by the Capuans, for it ruined whatever plans he may have had for the year 214 BC. Making matters worse, Quintus Fabius, the son of Fabius Maximus, used Hannibal's absence in Apulia to capture the cities of Aegae and Asculum. Making do, Hannibal besieged the city of Puteoli and plundered the countryside, trying to secure a port closer to his base at Capua. And it was here that he had a most unexpected visit. 5 nobles from Tarentum, a Greek city in southern Italy, had come to meet Hannibal. These men were among many who previously fought for Rome but were captured by the Carthaginians, some at Trasimene, others at Cannae. But because they were non-Romans, Hannibal treated them fairly and released them to their homes, declaring he came to Italy only to fight Rome. This courtesy paid dividend. It was these Greeks who now believed that they would enjoy greater autonomy if they sided with Carthage. They despised Rome's heavy-handedness and saw their chance to regain their long-lost influence. You see, in its heyday, Tarentum was a major regional power in southern Italy and a leading force in Magna Graecia, its prosperity renowned throughout the ancient world. The city had the best harbour in southeastern Italy and a large, fertile hinterland. But the withdrawal of King Pyrrhus and the subsequent Roman conquest of his allies marked the end of Tarentine hegemony in southern Italy. The city was forced to accept an unequal alliance with Rome, which forced them to support Roman foreign policy, to receive a Roman garrison in its citadel, contribute ships and troops to Rome when it went to war, and pay an annual tribute. Now, more than 50 years later, these harsh economic and military burdens placed on Tarentum and its inexorable assimilation into the Roman-dominated economic system was still the source of irritation for many Tarentines. At the meeting, the 5 nobles declared a pro-Carthaginian faction was forming in the city. If Hannibal's standard appeared in front of Tarentum, the gates would open. Hannibal welcomed their sentiment and bade them farewell. Soon he will be with them, he said. Meanwhile, Fabius Maximus and Marcellus were again elected consuls. At present, their biggest concern was the alliance between Hannibal and Hieronymus. The Syracusan fleet, joined by the Carthaginian navy, could potentially dominate the seas around Sicily, provide troops and supplies to Hannibal, and help him lock down southern Italy out of Rome's grasp. If this were to happen, Macedon would be further enticed into joining Hannibal, providing yet more men and material. The 2 consuls took this threat so seriously that they outfitted a new fleet, bringing the Roman navy up to around 150 vessels of war, mostly stationed in Bruttium and Sicily. And for the first time in Rome's history, the ships were manned by professional seamen. Keeping the Sicilian fleet active at all times was of such importance that the Senate mandated the salaries of the sailors be funded by the wealthy elite, ensuring payments would be on time to avoid any chance of mutiny. On land, the size of the Roman army towered over the Carthaginians. But Hannibal still inspired fear, and on his way to Tarentum, he stopped at Nola for a 3rd time. Advancing on the city, Hannibal put more pressure on the Roman flanks to get access to the gates, while holding in the center. But this time, as the battle commenced, Marcellus kept his men back. Looking past the chaos of battle, Hannibal noticed that, strangely, Marcellus lacked the initiative he so regularly showed in previous encounters. Sensing that something was wrong, the Carthaginian general ordered his men to pull back. His intuition was correct. Marcellus had sent Claudius Nero with an elite cavalry detachment to flank the Carthaginian army and strike at their rear once the battle commenced. However, to avoid detection by Hannibal's scouts, Claudius Nero took the longer route and got lost, failing to reach the battlefield in time. By noon, the Carthaginian general arrayed his men at a distance and challenged Marcellus to attack. But the Roman line still did not move. Clearly, Marcellus was up to something, Hannibal thought. Once again displaying his uncanny ability to sense danger, he turned his army and made way for Tarentum. Marcellus, although unable to defeat Hannibal, had matched him on the battlefield for a third time, something no other Roman general was able to do at this stage of the war. At Nola, Marcellus truly lived up to the reputation he gained about a decade earlier when he speared the Gallic king Viridomarus. He then stripped the armor off his opponent and claimed it as spolia opima, translated from Latin as rich spoils. This highest of Roman honors could only be attained by generals who personally killed the opposing commander in single combat. For some perspective, only 3 Romans in history achieved this feat: the mythical king Romulus in 752 BC, Aulus Cornelius Cossus in 437 BC, and Marcus Claudius Marcellus in 222 BC. It was an incredibly rare achievement. At Nola, some hours later, Claudius Nero finally found his way to the battlefield. But by the time he appeared from the nearby hills, the Carthaginian column had gone. Pressing on towards Tarentum, Hannibal couldn't help but notice that Hanno failed to appear with his army. But somewhere near Benevento, the Carthaginians came across a field littered with thousands of bodies of their brothers in arms, rotting in the sun. These were Hanno's men. On his way north from Bruttium to meet Hannibal near Capua, Hanno was intercepted by Gracchus. The ensuing battle was a gruesome slogging match. The Numidians were superior on the flanks, but in the center, Hanno's Bruttians and Lucanians were checked by Gracchus's infantry, comprised of slaves hastily trained and incorporated into the army due to lack of manpower after the defeat at Cannae. In a brilliant move, Gracchus promised every slave freedom if they were victorious. This resulted in an almost fanatical surge of morale, and the slave legions eventually broke Hanno's center. Of the 18,200 men in the Carthaginian army, only 2,000 escaped the slaughter, including Hanno. Most tragically, 1,200 irreplaceable Numidian horsemen were lost. Although Hanno survived, his defeat at Benevento left Hannibal with no more than 45,000 troops in Italy. Worse, back in Campania, Marcellus led a daring action in besieging and ultimately capturing Casilinum, a town that served as a key crossing on the Volturnus River that controlled direct access to Capua from the north. A rider was sent to notify Hannibal that Casilinum was lost, but it is unknown if the messenger ever reached him. During the late summer of 214 BC, the Carthaginian general continued through the Apennine Mountains, destroying Roman possessions as he went. Meanwhile, across the sea to the east, Philip attacked Roman Illyria. The simultaneous actions of the two commanders pose an interesting question. Did Hannibal and Philip coordinate their plans? We may never know, but a few things suggest they did. As Hannibal advanced towards the Salento Peninsula, Philip's invasion with 120 ships forced the Romans to transfer much of their own fleet from Tarentum to Brundisium. One legion then sailed to Illyria to check the Macedon advance under the command of Valerius himself. If Hannibal could take Tarentum with its valuable port, and Philip managed to overrun Illyria, Carthage and Macedon could link up. Moreover, Tarentum could become his new headquarters. Thus, Valerius's forces were pinned down in the Salento Peninsula and Illyria, split in two on either side of the sea. And although Philip's war effort would falter unexpectedly quickly, for now it seemed to Rome that another front had opened in Illyria. Meanwhile, Fabius used Hannibal's absence to lay waste to Samnite lands loyal to Carthage. The operation was exceptionally brutal. Some 25,000 were captured and summarily executed. To the south, Gracchus launched a raiding mission into Lucania. Seeking to capitalize on his victory at Beneventum, he dispersed his forces to cover a wider area. But Hanno had by now recruited several thousand troops and moved against Gracchus upon learning from his scouts that his army was divided. Despite no longer having the swift Numidians in his ranks, with the help of the locals loyal to Carthage, Hanno was able to find and destroy the Romans piecemeal before they had time to react or regroup. He inflicted on Gracchus the same losses he previously suffered at Beneventum. But more importantly, he repelled the attack on Bruttium and Lucania and gained more time to rebuild his army. By early autumn 214 BC, as Hannibal entered Tarentine territory, all plundering stopped. Foragers and raiders stayed with the column as he wanted to win sympathies of the Tarentines. But once he reached the city, to his surprise, no one was there to welcome him. Somehow the Romans found out about the Tarentine conspiracy and took drastic measures. A 5,000-strong Roman garrison was stationed in Tarentum on high alert, commanded by Marcus Livius Macatus. Another garrison was placed in nearby Metapontum, ready to intervene. More of Valerius's troops were stripped from the Illyrian expedition and placed in Venusia and Brundisium, ready to march to Tarentum's defense at a moment's notice. The increased Roman presence discouraged the cities of the Salento Peninsula from defecting. As an added measure, Macatus took hostages from the families of Tarentine aristocrats and sent them to Rome, ensuring the gates of Tarentum would remain closed. Hannibal did not linger. He left the lands of Tarentum intact, as he did not want to abandon plans to win the city over to his side. Marching southwest along the coast, he plundered the towns and countryside around Metapontum, advancing as far as Heraclea unchallenged, before turning north towards Apulia. Burning and pillaging as he went, his aim was to demonstrate Rome's inability or unwillingness to protect its Italiate Greek allies. This was a strong message to his supporters in Tarentum. Descending from the Apennine slopes into the grazing lands below, the Carthaginians confiscated 4,000 horses and drove off thousands more to prevent the Romans from using them. Finally, by late autumn, Hannibal reached Salapia, where he set up his winter quarters, a suitable location chosen for its expansive foraging grounds. Across the sea in Iberia, victories of the Scipio brothers convinced most tribes of the Ebro Valley to ally themselves with Rome. But the tribes south of the Ebro were still hesitant. And the arrival of Mago Barca with a fresh army to reinforce his brother Hasdrubal, as well as a third army led by Hasdrubal Gisgo, cemented Carthage's dominance in Iberia. That said, after the catastrophic defeat at Hibera in 215 BC, the priority of the Carthaginian Senate in 214 was not conquest, but stabilization of Iberia. Though they possessed a much larger army than the Scipio brothers, they had to utilize these troops to both fight the Romans and control the vast tribal territories under their rule, from whom they extracted taxes, resources, and troops. So the Carthaginians opted to freeze the conflict and continue building up their forces until they were ready to drive out the Romans from Iberia. The Scipio brothers, in their base at Tarraco, could only hope to defend the territory under their control. And thus the war in Iberia turned into a stalemate, a situation that would continue for over 2 years. Back in Campania, Rome did not press its advantage after capturing Casilinum. Consuls Fabius and Marcellus were far more concerned with the troubling developments in Syracuse. It was decided that Marcellus would depart for Sicily at once. His proactive stance against the Carthaginians prevented the fall of several key Roman positions in Campania and had weakened Hannibal's hold on the region. It was hoped that he could repeat the same feat and reverse the setbacks Rome suffered in Sicily. But once he disembarked, Marcellus found that the situation on the island was in disarray. The alliance between Rome and Syracuse, which had lasted for 50 years, had all but crumbled. Hannibal's agents, Hippocrates and Epicydes, with their roots in Syracuse, had cemented the alliance between Carthage and Syracuse. Roman praetor Appius Claudius made a last-ditch effort to bring Syracuse back into the fold, sending envoys to King Hieronymus's court. The diplomats declared to the king that they had come to renew the alliance which had existed with his grandfather, Hero II. But Hieronymus and his courtiers laughed at the Romans. Smirkingly, Hieronymus rhetorically asked them if the stories of the disaster at Cannae were true. He quipped that he wanted to hear the truth from the Romans themselves before deciding who to side with. Clearly, it was his understanding that the Romans were losing the war. But from his condescending tone, it was obvious that the young king had already made up his mind. The Roman envoys remained calm, saying they would return once Hieronymus learned to receive embassies seriously. But before leaving, they warned him, rather than asked him, not to abandon their alliance so lightly. Hieronymus promptly departed the capital with his entourage and headed for Leontini, where he enjoyed strong support and would be safe from his enemies in Syracuse. But the pro-Roman faction had had enough of the young monarch. While en route to Leontini, the king was assassinated. However, in an unusual twist, instead of the throne going to a pro-Roman candidate, Hannibal's allies Hippocrates and Epicydes were elected magistrates on the Syracusan ruling council. They immediately set up their base in Leontini. With 4,000 troops under their command, they began to raid Roman towns and countryside. Still, Appius Claudius managed to recover most of the territory held by the Greek rebels, with only the northeastern corner of Sicily remaining hostile to Rome. Marcellus conducted the second attack. In August, he stormed and took Leontini. 2,000 Carthaginian sympathizers were lined up in the streets, beaten and killed, while Hippocrates and Epicydes retreated with the remnants of their army to Herbesos. There they convinced the city's commander to bring 8,000 troops to the city of Syracuse to help repel the Romans. Marcellus, meanwhile, took 1/3 of the army and moved into Sicily's interior. His plan was to reduce Syracusan strongholds of Haena, Herbesos, and the fortified coastal cities of Megara and Helorus, as well as to finally deal with the Greek rebel cities in the mountainous northeast that tied up significant Roman resources in the area. Knowing that this operation would take months to complete, he tasked Appius Claudius with preparing the remaining 2/3 of the army for the siege of the city of Syracuse. By the end of 214 BC, it was clear that the Hannibalic hegemony in Italy had weakened. After years of trying, Hanno was unsuccessful in capturing Reggio, an important city that controlled the Straits of Messina. Rome captured the strategically important town of Casilinum, and now Capua was on the defensive. The Romans also recovered towns in Samnium, Lucania, and northern Apulia. Worse, without reinforcements, funds, and supplies promised to him by Carthage, Hannibal was by now obviously struggling to maintain control over his territory in southern Italy. He was losing momentum, and he needed new battlefield victories that would persuade fresh defections from Rome. To achieve this, he set his sights on Tarentum. At the start of 213 BC, Rome elected Fabius Maximus's son, Quintus Fabius, and Sempronius Gracchus as consuls. Hannibal's own war effort this year would reach a new intensity as he probed for new vulnerabilities of his enemy. In March, he moved into the lands of the Salentini, the so-called heel of Italy, which offered rich foraging grounds. The presence of his army there encouraged Philip to continue his own war efforts in Illyria. This forced the Romans to send more troops from the Salento to Greece, which allowed dissent to grow among the Tarentine, Messapian, and Lepigian communities. The ultimate objective of Hannibal's operation in the Salento was the capture of Tarentum, but for much of 213 BC, he focused his efforts on rallying local support, understanding that to achieve his goal, he must first weaken Rome's authority in the region. Fortunately for Hannibal, the Messapian aristocracy suffered economic decline under Roman rule, especially since the start of the war, and many were by now eager to throw off the Roman yoke. By early summer, several cities defected to Hannibal, among which were Uzentum, a strategic hub in the heel of Italy, and Mandoria, just east of Tarentum, which could serve as a base of operations. Other important centers also joined him, such as Naratum and Hydruntum, as well as Lupiae, the second most populous city in the Salento Peninsula. Hannibal would spend the spring and summer seasons forming a buffer zone between Tarentum and the Roman base at Brundisium. He knew that as his presence increased in the Salento, the Tarentine nobility would eventually advance their own clandestine anti-Roman plans. But perhaps more importantly, Hannibal welcomed the much-needed new recruits from the region into his army. However, to the north in Apulia, Rome continued with the strategy of attacking Hannibal's allies during his absence. Consul Quintus Fabius besieged and stormed Arpi, the epicenter of support for Hannibal in Apulia. Heavy fighting in the narrow streets during a rainy night convinced the consul to offer terms to avoid massive casualties for his own army. Fabius agreed to allow the 5,000-strong Carthaginian garrison to leave unharmed in exchange for giving up the city. While the loss of Arpi was a setback for Hannibal, his hold over Apulia was evident to the Romans. Just like Arpi, the other Apulian cities were garrisoned, well provisioned, and were now on high alert. Dislodging the Carthaginians was far from being a foregone conclusion. Some good news for Hannibal came from Brutium, where Hanno the Elder defeated a pro-Roman Lucanian army and advanced into Lucania to recover several cities. This victory did much to boost confidence among the Greek cities of southern Italy that Carthage would win the war. But while Hannibal and Hanno renewed the offensive, in Sicily the pro-Carthaginian faction was on the defensive. By April 213 BC, the contest on the island reached a crescendo. Marcellus had brought much of the island under Roman control and had commenced the siege of the city of Syracuse, the last major pro-Carthaginian holdout in Sicily. In July, across the sea in Africa, for the first time since the start of the war, trouble was brewing in Carthage's own backyard. Numidia, a vast Berber region, was divided into two kingdoms in the 3rd century BC. The Massalii were a Berber federation in eastern Numidia, formed by an amalgamation of smaller tribes ruled over by King Gaia. Their relationship with Carthage resembled that of a protectorate. The powerful empire dominated Massalii politics through skillful diplomatic maneuvering, marriages, economic dependency, and playing off local tribes and kingdom rivalries. As such, the Massalii fully committed to fighting alongside Carthage by sending both regular troops and mercenaries, their strong and proficient cavalry force being a crucial component of Carthaginian armies. In western Numidia were the powerful Masazili. They were an extremely rich Berber kingdom that could support a large army, and just like their eastern neighbors, they possessed a strong cavalry. As such, their king Syphax always harbored ambitions to rule a fully independent kingdom. To this end, at the start of the Second Punic War, he was sympathetic to the Romans, but he had to refrain from joining their side in the war, because in 218 BC, Carthage was a vast, wealthy superpower. It dominated North African politics and held strong influence within Syphax's kingdom, including a prominent pro-Carthaginian faction and close economic ties that benefited most of the Masazili nobility, who would oppose siding with Rome. But while Syphax could not openly be hostile to Carthage, he showed defiance by remaining largely neutral and refused to send regular troops to fight for Carthage. However, many thousands of Numidian mercenaries from his kingdom did serve in Carthaginian armies in both Iberia and Italy, though their services did not come cheap. But now, in 213 BC, messages coming from Rome claimed that the tide of the war was turning. Persuaded, Syphax swayed sections of the Masazili nobility and decided it was time to go to war with Carthage. The Scipio brothers sent Quintus Statorius, a centurion from Iberia, to help train Syphax's infantry in the Roman way of war, as well as the art of fortification. To counter the threat, King Gaius's son, Prince Massinissa, was put in charge of 30,000 troops to confront the threat. The two armies met west of Cirta, where Massinissa completely routed Syphax and his Roman-trained army. The Masazilian king fled west towards the lands of the Mauri, where he would spend several months building a new army. Despite this victory, the Carthaginians knew that Syphax was a serious threat that had to be neutralized. Fortunately for Carthage, by the autumn of 213, the situation in Iberia had stabilized, and the Senate could afford to recall Hasdrubal Barca, ordering him to prepare to cross with his army into western Numidia. Back at Tarentum, news reached the city that some of the noble hostages held by Rome attempted to escape, but were caught and executed. This provoked outrage among Tarentine aristocrats, further strengthening the support for Hannibal. By executing the hostages, Rome lost much of the leverage they had over the anti-Roman Tarentine aristocracy. A coup de main was not long in coming, led by young aristocrats Philemenus and Nico. Throughout the winter, they gathered more supporters within the city, and once the snow melted, they put their plan into action. Under the guise of going on a lavish hunting expedition, the conspirators rode to Hannibal's winter camp, just 3 days' march from Tarentum. Hannibal's terms were too good to pass up. Tarentum's freedom was guaranteed. No tribute would be extracted by Carthage. The city was free to appoint their own magistrates, who would rule under Tarentine laws. They did not have to accept a Punic garrison within the walls, unless they chose to do so. Roman property and citizens, however, were to be seized by Hannibal and used for ransom or sold into slavery. Philemenus and Necho readily accepted. They stood up, went to where Hannibal was seated, and whispered in his ear their plan for the betrayal of Rome. The next day, Hannibal released a small portion of cattle from his baggage train. The conspirators then brought these back to Tarentum, claiming to have found them roaming free and had captured them. They repeated this ruse several times in the weeks following. Philemenus preferred hunting at night, supposedly to avoid frequent Punic patrols. He would always return with plenty to show for, and was eager to share the spoils with the guards and commander at the side gate he used. The Romans had gotten so used to the routine that whenever they heard Philemenus's whistle during the night, they would let him in without checking, eager to get their hands on the prize. Then, during one night in early March, Hannibal led his fastest 8,000 cavalry and 2,000 Gallic and Libyan infantry out of the camp. 80 Numidian riders screened far ahead of the column, with orders to capture or kill anyone they encounter, but otherwise they were to give off the impression that they were a regular foraging party. 3 days later, Hannibal stopped the column in a gorge not far from the city, hidden from view. Here he rested the men for a day and briefed his officers on his plan. The following night, the attack began. In complete silence, Hannibal led 6,000 horse and 1,000 foot towards the Temenid Gate, accompanied by Necho and a group of conspirators. The troops were ordered to stay compact and obey Hannibal's every order. To the south of Hannibal, Philemenus led a group of 1,000 Libyan infantry towards the side gate he regularly used for his hunting expeditions. 2,000 cavalry were left as a rear guard to cover the escape or reinforce the attack. The Tarentine conspirators deliberately chose this night because a pre-arranged feast in the city was in full swing, and Livius, the commander of the Roman garrison, was in attendance. Through hours of song and laughter, they kept him drinking until he had to be carried home. By the time the music died down, the gates were breached. Hearing Philemenus's whistle coming from the darkness, the guards allowed him through the side entrance. While they inspected their prize, 30 Libyans rushed in. Quickly overwhelming the few sentries, they proceeded to open the gate for the rest of the infantry. Meanwhile, with the help of the conspirators, Hannibal breached the main gate, surprising most of the guards in their sleep, and rushed through the streets towards the Forum, where he was supposed to meet Philemenus and the Libyan infantry. Disorganized Roman troops rushed into the streets, but were quickly overrun. Livius and his officers escaped towards the citadel at the last minute. Adding to the confusion, conspirators waiting at pre-designated locations around the city blew Roman military trumpets, sounding off a mix of different orders. This had the effect of sending in Roman troops piecemeal into the meat grinder. However, a good portion of the garrison managed to retreat across the narrow promontory to the citadel before Hannibal could reach it. Livius sent an urgent message via boat to the nearby Metapontum. By early morning, Hannibal ordered the building of a wall to cut off the citadel from the rest of the city. The citadel controlled the only entrance into the Tarentum harbour, and for now the men inside could receive supplies by sea. The entire garrison of Metapontum arrived several days later. Hannibal made several attempts to storm the citadel. Meanwhile, to prevent a further influx of Roman supplies and manpower, he organized the transport of Tarentine ships from the harbour overland. dragging the galleys through the streets and into the sea, from where they could blockade the citadel. The direct assaults failed, and once the wall was complete, Hannibal left the Tarentines in charge of the blockade. The capture of Tarentum was a bitter blow for the Romans, and a great yet incomplete victory for Hannibal. The large Roman garrison was determined to withstand the siege at all costs, often enduring near-famine conditions. This meant that the power of Tarentum could not be fully utilized for Hannibal's war effort, as resources needed to be allocated towards blockading the defenders from receiving supplies and reinforcements by sea. Nevertheless, by taking Tarentum, Hannibal caused a domino effect. More Messapian communities joined him, and much of the Salento Peninsula was now under his control. Metapontum and Heraclea also defected. Even in Brundisium, rumors circulated that the Messapian aristocracy within the city were ready to betray Rome. By April 213 BC, Hannibal's territory in southern Italy reached its greatest extent. But the Carthaginian army would not be resting for long. A rider bearing grim news entered Tarentum and demanded to see Hannibal in person. Out of breath, the messenger dismounted, and as he ran in to be received by Hannibal, he fell to the ground, his hand extending a note. It was from Capua. The message read, "We are besieged by 4 legions. Come at once." If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.